Hello, good afternoon everyone to a lovely sunny day. The English weather has gone away thankfully and we're almost Caribbean, which is very suitable. It's an enormous pleasure to be here with Professor Vincent Brown to talk about his remarkable book, Tackys Revolt, that tells the story of the largest slave insurrection in the British Caribbean in the 18th century. At once gripping and tragic and inspiring at the same time, it's been heaped with prizes and widely praised by reviewers across the world. For me, the review that really gets to the heart of the book's achievement was published in The Guardian, and the review acknowledges that history is written by the victors, but this book, as the reviewer says, corrects a victor's perspective and recovers the lost history and dignity of the enslaved. And I think a way that you do this, Vince, is to put what is often portrayed in sort of traditional histories as a local and even peripheral armed insurrection in the context of the wider wars occurring in Europe, in the Americas, and in particular in West Africa. One of the many things I learned from the book was the surprisingly small percentage of the enslaved in Jamaica who were Creole, i.e. born into slavery in the West Indies, because of course a child born to an enslaved mother would automatically become the property of the woman's owner. Instead, the majority are born into freedom in West Africa. And you really do address this, and in particular a group that the Europeans called the Coromantees, who they both admired and feared for their strength, their mental acuity, and their discipline. Now, you begin the first chapter, I think the line 1 of the first chapter, you say, the story starts in Africa. So that's where I think we should start today. I wonder if you could say a little bit about the political situation in West Africa at this time and the relative power balance between Africans and Europeans.
Yeah, I think that's a good place to begin. But first, let me thank Kat for that wonderful introduction, and thank all of you for coming here today on this hot day and the last day of the festival. It's a fantastic pleasure to be here. I've had a great time so far. Looking forward to this session and your questions after our little chit-chat here. And it's fantastic to be in conversation with Matthew Parker, who's a historian I admire tremendously, in part because he asked the right questions. You cannot hear? Can you hear now? Okay. And I think that question about West Africa and why we begin there is a fantastic place to start. The reason I begin this story in West Africa, and as Kat said, this was the largest slave uprising in the 18th century British Empire, and it had all kinds of reverberations that we'll talk about a little bit later. But it was organized and executed principally by Africans from the Gold Coast, roughly the region of West Africa that we now call Ghana. And these people had been born with their own political struggles, in their own context, before they had been captured by Europeans and enslaved and brought to the Americas. They had a history and a politics that came with them. And we don't often think that way about enslaved Africans. For the most part, we think of Africa and the African slaves who came to the Americas as being without a history. And I think this is in part because African history itself is something that's not well known, certainly not where I teach in the United States. One of the founders of European philosophy, G.W.F. Hegel, once proclaimed that Africa was no historical part of the world. And what that meant was that you didn't see transformation there. You didn't see state building. You didn't see the kinds of empires and radical changes that you saw in Europe and other parts of the world. But that wasn't true. And so one of the things I wanted to do with this book is illustrate, document, show how African history reverberated in the Americas. With that said, many of these people who came to Jamaica in the 18th century had military experience already. So those rebels were already soldiers in Africa. And for those of you who don't know, one of the primary ways in which people became captive in Africa and found themselves enslaved in the Americas was through war. there were war captives, where there were people displaced by the many wars on the West African coast, because there were a number of large and expanding states in West Africa. Ashanti, many people will know, but also Akwamu, Dinshira, Akyem, and other smaller polities that warred with each other as they vied for supremacy behind the coast. And anytime they went to war, often people would be captured, enslaved, sold to the Europeans, and they would come out to the Americas, where often those people, especially the soldiers, regrouped. Sometimes in completely new, what we call categories of belonging, new ethnicities, because they spoke similar languages, or worshiped similar gods, or recognized similar kinds of political authority vis-a-vis Africans from other parts of the coast. And that is the case with these Coromontes from the Gold Coast, who came to the Americas, and sometimes former enemies now collaborated in these uprisings against the British.
And very early in the book, I think probably on the very first page, you introduce three characters, Apongo, otherwise known as Wager, John Cope, and Arthur Forrest. I wonder if you could say a little bit about them and how they all ended up in Jamaica.
Well, this was a fascinating story, and it's in many ways the story that I began with, which is, as Matthew knows very well, there was an 18th century overseer in Jamaica named Thomas Thistlewood, who was there about 36 years, and he left a diary. And in his diary, he records a fascinating account of one of these slave rebels, one of the leaders of the slave rebellion in his parish on the western side of the island, Westmoreland, who he said had been a chief in West Africa, a military official. And in West Africa, he had been accustomed to going to Cape Coast Castle, Britain's principal fort on the Gold Coast, to trade with Cape Coast Castle's governor or chief agent, right? A man named John Cope. John Cope retired from his post at Cape Coast Castle and ended up in Jamaica with a plantation in Westmoreland Parish. Sometime after that, this man Apongo, who had known John Cope from West Africa, was himself captured, enslaved, came to Jamaica, where he again encountered John Cope. And John Cope would on Sundays lay out a tablecloth for this man and treat him as a man of honor, even though he was now enslaved, and insinuated to him that when his owner came back to the island, the owner was a Royal Navy ship captain named Arthur Forrest, John Cope would help to have him redeemed and sent back to Africa. Now, John Cope dies in 1756, just a couple of weeks before Arthur Forrest returns to the island, extinguishing Apongo's hopes of being redeemed and sent home. And sometime after that, he becomes involved in planning and executing this largest of slave revolts in the 18th century British Empire.
So the British and European presence in West Africa is fairly precarious, isn't it? Through disease and through the fact that they are very small fish compared to these powerful African polities. Now, in India at this time, of course, we've just had the Battle of Plassey, and the British have taken effective control of Bengal and the Carnatic coast. The Mughals are in decline. The Marathas have taken Delhi. But the Caribbean is a very different story, isn't it? Because Jamaica has been a British colony for 100 years, the other islands even longer. How important was Jamaica in the Caribbean to the British Empire?
Yeah, so I mean, it's worth establishing the first British Empire before the real locus of power in the British Empire was South Asia. It was there in the Americas. And Britain had about 26 or more colonies in the Americas, not the 13 that Americans only think of because those became the United States, but 26. And by far, the most important of those colonies in the Americas were those colonies in the Caribbean, right? They were more profitable, they were more militarily significant, and the planters who were there were much better connected politically in the UK. And Jamaica was the most important of those American colonies. If one wants to make a comparison between, say, the wealth of Jamaican planters and the wealth of colonists in a place like Massachusetts, where I now teach, the Jamaican planters were 50 times wealthier than a white person in Massachusetts. So vastly, vastly more important than those other parts of the Americas that we think of as being the heart of the British Empire for the most part.
And so Apongo has had his hopes dashed that he was going to be his freedom was going to be bought by John Cope. What kind of life is he and his fellow plantation slaves living at this time?
So this gets into the brutality of Jamaican slavery, the brutality of sugar plantation society. Some of you will know that most of the places, almost often when sugar has been grown, it's been grown with enslaved labor. It takes enormous amounts of labor to grow sugar, to mill it fast, process it, and export it. It was also enormously profitable, right? So it took great numbers of laborers to come in. Those laborers were brutally treated, right? And then oftentimes they didn't live more than 3, 4, 5 years. Now that was fine with the sugar planters because sugar was so profitable that it was in fact economically efficient to import laborers from Africa, work them to death within 3 to 5 years, and import new laborers to replace them. And the profits sustained that kind of lifestyle for a very long time. So Jamaica was, any place that was growing sugar in the Americas was, an extremely deadly place, a brutal place, and a place that was governed by terror, I think you would have to say. So this man, Thomas Thistlewood, that left this diary is notorious among people who've read this diary for his sadism. He recorded unashamedly the almost daily rapes of enslaved women under his authority. He recorded brutal punishments, sickening punishments that I won't even go into here. But it was the kind of society that was organized only for the benefit of those very few at the top.
So, and slavery depended as well on not just on physical terror, but on sort of mental humiliation and degradation. It's one of the essential requisites of slavery. But at the same time, there is, particularly in Jamaica, perhaps because of its topography, there is a continual slave plotting, slave rebellions, and resistance, which climaxes, I guess, in what happened in 1760.
Yeah, I mean, certainly any time you have that kind of brutality, that kind of daily humiliation, that is going to demand a response. And that response in Jamaica was frequent and violent. So Jamaica was also, in addition to being the most profitable British colony in the Americas, one of the most unstable. There were major rebellions at least every decade. This being one of the largest in the 18th century, but rebellions happened frequently. From the time the British first conquered the island from the Spanish in 1655, all the way through the end of slavery in Jamaica in the 1830s, there were uprisings. And
Jamaica provided much more hope. I mean, we look at Barbados, which is sort of flat and isolated. There's nowhere really, if you've run away from the plantation, there's no great hiding places. Jamaica's very different, isn't it? Because it's got this mountainous topography with thick scrub and jungle. And living on the mountains, you have communities made up largely of runaway slaves that are sustaining their independence. The Maroons. I wonder if you could explain who they are, because they are absolutely crucial for this story, aren't they?
Yeah. Well, one of the things about Jamaica that makes it so conducive to the kind of rebellions we see there through the 18th century is, as Matthew said, its topography. It's mountainous. It's heavily wooded. There are lots of places where if people can escape from the plantations, they can hide out, eke out a life in the wilderness, and defend themselves from the planters and from recapture. From the time of the British conquest of the island in 1655, there were always communities of these formerly enslaved people who had escaped to the mountainous areas, to the thick bush, and formed communities. They were able to defend themselves from the planters. These are people we call Maroons. Now, they would often raid the plantations for supplies. They would often go and recruit from the plantations to increase their numbers. And this was upsetting to the planters who were trying to organize their societies for stability.
I mean, it means essentially Jamaica was never completely conquered by the British.
That's right. I mean, the island itself always had those unconquered territories, those wild areas that the Maroons could hide out and maintain their own freedom. Now, through the 17th century and in the first couple of decades of the 18th century, the Maroons began to fight increasingly hard-fought battles with the British colonists. So much so that in the 1730s, during what's called the First Maroon War, the British didn't know that they would be able to keep the island. They were not confident they would be able to maintain slave society on Jamaica. And so they signed treaties with the Maroons that granted the Maroons their freedom in these mountainous areas, but also compelled the Maroons to police future slave rebellions and to return runaway slaves to the plantations. So by diplomatic treaty, in order to maintain their freedom, they had to become allies of plantation society. And that, I think, is one of the tragic ironies of this story.
And what that means for people like Apongo is it means that sort of easier route to freedom, to escaping from the plantation into the mountains, is now taken away from them to a large extent. And so they decide to plan their own insurrection and across the whole island. Is that the plan? How do they communicate, and what plans do they make? What are the aims that they have?
Yeah. Well, I mean, again, so one of the things when those areas of escape are closed off, right, then one of the only avenues available for seeking freedom is to overthrow the entire slave society. And so that is the plan in Tackys Revolt, for the most part, to eliminate slavery in all of Jamaica. Now, in different places in the island, there are different aims and different strategies and different tactics. So on the north side of the island, where we don't have the same kind of presence of the Maroons, the slaves hope to take that entire parish. On the west side of the island, where some of those Maroons were fighting them alongside the British, they hoped to establish their own Maroon community that they could defend both from those Maroons but also from the planters. And here again, we have to think about the different kinds of aims that slaves had. To eliminate slavery, for sure, but different parts of the island conducted their strategy in different ways.
And there was a terrible misstep, wasn't there, on timings? Can you sort of talk us through, because your book is called Tackys Revolt, but actually that's only a part, actually quite a small part of the whole, what you call the Coromantee War. So Tacky and St. Maria on the north coast, they go too early.
Yeah, right. So I just mentioned there were different parts of the revolt, different revolts in different parts of the island. And in that northern parish, the parish of St. Maria, where the revolt started, it seems from the sources that they started a bit too early. So in St. Mary, they revolt too soon for the people in Westmoreland, in the nether parish, to combine with them. And so the island-wide revolt happens in stages, develops first in one parish, then in another, and then in another, and that, I think, leads to its failure ultimately.
So how does the revolt in St. Maria start?
Well, okay, so on the night of April 7th, early morning, April 8th, about 100 people on a single plantation in St. Mary Parish organize and march up to the fort at Port Maria, which was the British fort in that parish. They conquer the fort, take all the arms in the fort, and then begin a long march up the main roads of the parish, attacking plantations and burning plantations as they go. They managed to attack, I think, 8 or 9 plantations before they stop and decide to think about what their next move is. And at that point, the militia rallies, organizes, attacks them to no great effect. And again, the British are not sure that they're going to be able to conquer this island until, and this is crucial, they call up the Maroons. And it's in fact the Maroons who helped the British suppress this revolt that leads to their success in eliminating that part of the revolt in St. Mary Parish.
In Westmoreland, which has, I think, the lowest proportion of whites to enslaved people, it's like 1 to 16 or something like that. Yeah. That sort of happens a little bit later, but it's on a much bigger scale, isn't it?
Yeah. So the planters were worried about what happened in St. Mary because they're always worried about any kind of revolt that happens. But that revolt that was led by this man named Tacky, who's given us the name of the revolt, was much smaller than the revolt on the western side of the island, led by this man Apongo, who I started with, the man mentioned in Thomas Thistlewood's diary. That revolt, the St. Mary revolt, lasted about 2 weeks. The revolt in Westmoreland lasted many months, stretched into a neighboring parish of St. Elizabeth, and lasted all the way into 1761. This revolt started on April 7th, 1760, and didn't end until January or February of 1761. So that Westmoreland revolt is in fact much more consequential to the overall progress of the revolt.
So you say in the book that 90% of the population of the island are enslaved.
Yeah.
So had everyone risen up against the British, surely it would have succeeded. So there's a choice. There's a very interesting bit that you put in your book. Thomas Thistlewood, he's got a choice whether to trust the slaves on his plantation, and he does. He gives some of his key senior slaves weapons to defend him and his property. In other places, a slave owner does the same thing, and the slaves shoot them and go off and join the rebels. So he takes a great risk, and it comes off. So can we put ourselves in the mind of an enslaved African on a plantation who has to make this decision? Because he's seen the burning plantations. He's seen this is a sign of a general uprising, and he has to decide, or she has to decide, do I join the rebellion or do I not? And not enough people joined for the rebellion to be a success. Yeah. So what was going through their mind? What decision making do they have to go through?
Well, I think what you're drawing our attention to, which is the fundamental heart of the book, which is we have to take the politics of enslaved people seriously. That they have political choices to make, right? And those political choices are going to be based on their historical experiences. They are 90% of the population enslaved, and yet there are lots of divisions among them that keep them from aligning with each other. Those can be divisions of language for Africans from different parts of the African coast. Those can be divisions in status because people perform different roles in plantation society. The ordinary worker in the fields had a different stake, even enslaved, than, say, a head driver who was also enslaved, or a boiler, someone who was a skilled worker who also might get a little bit more food, a little bit more shelter from the slaveholders, and they might have had different interests then than some of those other slaves. So there are all of these ways in which people had to make these very fast and fraught calculations about who they needed to align with and why, whom they could trust, right? This is why this rebellion was organized by Africans from one part of the coast who spoke each other's language, who recognized similar kinds of political authority, who recognized each other and could form alliances. But everybody had to figure out who they could ally with. And this was a very difficult thing in a society that was so violent, so riven by factionalism and difference, that the planters could divide the enslaved and conquer them that way.
So the rebellion is eventually put down. Something like 60 white people are killed, and there were possibly, in Westmoreland alone, 1,000 slaves up in arms against the British. Of those, I think 500 are either killed, or many actually, rather than be captured, they commit suicide. Thistlewood has this grisly mention in his diary of the smell coming from the woods of hanged slaves. And then some 500 are captured. What happens to them?
Yeah. So among those captured, a number are executed summarily. Sometimes there are hasty trials, generally without any kind of trial. A number of people are just brutalized and killed on the plantations where they're taken. But a number are also exiled. And so of the 500 or so people that are exiled, we've been able to track some of them. Some of them go to what was then called British Honduras, what's now Belize. Some of them go to South Carolina. Some of them go to Virginia. Some of them are smuggled into Saint-Domingue, what's now Haiti. And they carry the story of that rebellion with them. And so I think if we use our imaginations, we can understand that not only did they have their African history they brought to Jamaica that informed their choice to rebel, also in the new places they went to, they carried that political history of rebellion in Jamaica. So we know that in British Honduras, there was another rebellion involving some of those exiles just 5 years later in 1765. We also know that 10 years after the rebellion in Jamaica, 10, 15 years, the American Revolution happened in Virginia. And many of those people caught up in the American Revolution in 1775 and beyond had experience in Jamaica in 1760 and 1761. And then we can think about Saint-Domingue, which becomes Haiti. The Haitian Revolution, for those of you who don't know, that begins in 1791 and lasts until 1804, is the largest and most successful slave uprising in the history of the world. Saint-Domingue in the Caribbean was France's most profitable colony and the most profitable European colony in the world at the time. And that rebellion that eliminated the French presence in Saint-Domingue, creating the state of Haiti, was only the second post-colonial nation state in the Americas and the first to conclusively abolish slavery. We know that some of the people who had been involved in the rebellion in Jamaica were in Saint-Domingue at the time of that revolt. We also know that in Jamaica, people were telling the story of the revolt of the 1760s well into the early 19th century. We have this in recorded evidence. So we know that some of those people who went to Jamaica, who went from Jamaica to Saint-Domingue, who went to Virginia, who went to British Honduras and other places, were telling this alternative political history of slavery and freedom to each other on plantations all around the Caribbean and the Atlantic world. And I think that's quite interesting because it really draws our attention to the way in which these black people, these enslaved people, had their own sense of history, their own understanding of their predicament, and their own strategies for fighting their way out of it that they taught to each other.
And there were some gruesome punishments. We don't want to go down that road, but these were reported back in Britain. What impact, if any, did it have on public opinion in Britain itself? Yeah.
So interestingly enough, while the British profited so tremendously from Jamaican slave society, people who didn't have a direct investment and a direct involvement in Jamaican slavery tended to be unaware of the brutality of the society. But when they began to receive these news reports of some of the shocking punishments and executions meted out to the enslaved rebels, many Britons began to feel some empathy for them. And that empathy, not only in Great Britain, but also in other American colonies, especially those less invested in the slave society, like in Massachusetts, began to worry and wonder about what slavery was doing to the colonists, about who those colonists were and whether or not they could identify and ally with those people. And so that sympathy for enslaved rebels in some ways became one of the sentimental cracks in the foundation of British slavery, right? There's another aspect to this, less sentimental and less empathetic, which is that especially in North America, right, as those exiles from colonies in rebellion came into North America, planters there began to worry about the history they were bringing with them, about what they would be teaching their own enslaved people on their own plantations, and began to pass legislation against the slave trade because they worried that Africans coming from war-torn areas or Caribbean people coming up from territories in uprising might create uprisings in North America. And some of those earliest pieces of legislation against the slave trade helped to chip away at the planters' power, and I think inaugurate the larger movement for slave trade regulation and even abolition in 1807.
It's a very different image from the one that we're all familiar with, the abolitionist sort of medallion of the kneeling Negro pleading in a rather feeble way. Instead, we've got these people who stood toe to toe with the planters and really asserted themselves. And also, you mentioned that there's a campaign in Jamaica to make Tacky one of the national heroes, along with Nanny of the Maroons and Sam Sharp, who of course led a later rebellion. And this is part of, isn't it, a general sort of reassessment, both in the Caribbean and in Britain itself, of slavery and of the sort of the role of various parties in that. And do you think the campaign will be successful? And do you think the campaign for reparations will be successful? I think a very large amount of money are being asked by Caribbean nations in reparations for the crime of slavery.
Yeah, so a lot there. Let me kind of back up and talk more generally about the image of slavery and the enslaved that I'm hoping this book can upset a little bit. Again, people have this idea of enslaved people as like ciphers. I mean, the idea of a slave is that a slave is merely an extension of a slaveholder's will, of a master's will. These are people, right, who have their own will, hemmed in, abused, limited in extreme ways. And yet, when we start from the perspective of thinking about their initiative, we depart from that image of the kneeling slave begging to be recognized as a man and a brother, and think again about what their perspective on the world is, how they see their own predicament, right? So in that sense, what I'm hoping this book does is reintroduce people to the history of the enslaved as very much a fundamental part of the story. Now their descendants are making these demands for reparation. This gets into a separate issue, but I think if you look at this history in the larger sense, the most important thing about it is not just what is owed by the descendants of the planters, but that we can begin to understand this relationship that begins with colonization and slavery and has not ended with emancipation and freedom. Because it's colonization and slavery that produces the kinds of historical inequalities that we see between the UK and its former colonies, and that we see between white people and black people. Now, thinking about that relationship and how to address that, how to repair that, is going to be way more than just a question of money. Monetary damages should be paid, but it's really about how one thinks about a complete repair, a complete addressing of that history of inequality that was produced during this time of slavery.
Yeah, I'm very certain that your book is going to have a real impact in that direction, and I congratulate you again for it. Now, Vincent was very keen to have a little bit more time than usual for questions, so I would welcome anyone who, the lady there in blue.
After the slavery was abolished in 1830s in the Caribbean, resulting in a huge labor shortage, a huge number of laborers were imported from India, particularly from modern-day Bihar and UP. And these laborers were considered as heathens and interlopers by the Creole population. They were often met with hostility from the Creole population. What do you think was the reason behind this animosity between the two communities, and why couldn't these two communities unite against the plantation owners?
Yeah, fantastic question. And I think you can also push that same kind of animosity back into the era of slavery, right? So we have Africans from different regions of the coast, right, feeling animosity towards one another even though they're all enslaved. Because, as I alluded to earlier, right, any kind of little thing that you might be able to eke out for yourself in this society, any kind of little concession that you can get from the planter, that you can get from the colonists, right? People hold to very dearly, and they guard very jealously. And so after slavery, as you say, when new people come in, right, the people who have eked out some kind of small concession from those societies, meager as it might be, are guarding them jealously from these people they see as interlopers, right? And that, to me, is one of the real tragedies of the story of slavery, but also of the story of emancipation and the indentured servitude of the South Asians who came after slavery, which is they continue to focus on their competition with each other and not, right, on the exploitation of the slaveholders who are running the society for their own benefit.
There in the second row with the purple, with the orange.
Hi, Vincent. It's a great honor to see you here. So my question is that I'm just still reading your book in the halfway I'm that. So what made you just delve into this such a great subject of this Tackys Revolt? Is there a background story that you can tell that made you interested that you should go and research and write on it?
Yeah, so one of the stories was that story that I told you about that I read in the Thistlewood Diary, which is, this story of an African official meeting a slave trader, right? And then meeting him again in Jamaica, and then becoming a slave rebel, is not the way we normally think of slave rebellion, which is merely, slaves against masters in one particular colony, right, or on one particular plantation. This was already a transatlantic story. They required me to paint the story on a much broader canvas than we normally do. And so that became very fascinating to me, to think about what those journeys were that led two people who had met on the Gold Coast, right, as equals in a sense, and then met each other again in slave society under radically different terms. Now, I began to research each of those individual itineraries, thinking, how can I track these people across the Atlantic Ocean? And I learned that Apongo had also served on a Royal Navy warship because he was enslaved by a Royal Navy sea captain. So he had experience fighting the French and the Spanish aboard Royal Navy warships before he was put on a Jamaican plantation and became a slave rebel. So this is not somebody who's merely a subaltern, right, fighting his masters. This is someone who has his own initiative, his own military experience, his own strategies. And I thought that was a different kind of narrative that I wanted to tell.
Lady there in the glasses. Sorry, two ladies with glasses, sorry.
Sorry. You mentioned the uprising in what is now Haiti as well, which had many ramifications, one of which is the United States having the Louisiana Purchase. But comparing present-day Haiti with present-day Jamaica, there is a huge difference. Haiti has never really recovered, it seems like, if you think about it. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah. So there's a fantastic book that I like called Aftershocks of History by a man named Laurent Dubois, who's written also a fantastic history of the Haitian Revolution. And he really looks into the 19th century and the 20th century of Haiti. And one of the things he shows is that, there were various points at which Haiti did recover, at which Haiti was thriving in some ways, right? But Haiti is also the most invaded country in the Western Hemisphere. And so continuously, there was invasion after invasion after invasion, including by the United States from 1914 to 1934. So that was part of the story, or 1919 to 1934. So that was a fundamental part of the story. There's also, again, we go back to the competition between different sectors in society. So many of the elites that emerged from the Haitian Revolution, the military elite from the Haitian Revolution, begins to suppress the rural population. And so that creates an unstable situation in Haiti through the 19th century and on into the 20th century as well. So Haiti has remained impoverished, even though at various points there has been hope. That hope has often been extinguished by both internal and external forces. One of the external forces, obviously, is the French made Haiti pay an indemnity for the crime of having liberated themselves from French colonialism, which they paid for more than 100 years.
The other lady in glasses.
I recently took a class in the morning, and really pleased to meet you first. So my professor said that Indian people have a mentality that they are colonized, and they have been colonized for so long that they are slaves. They have a slave mentality. So they are not able to, create. So what are your views on that? As an African country has also been colonized, what are your views on that?
Yeah, my first question would be which Indians and which Africans, right? Would always be that. And I actually resist those kinds of sweeping judgments because even, as I said, even in a slave society, right, where 90% of this population is enslaved and brutalized, you have people who are creative, who are taking initiative, right, who, even though their agency is forbidden by law and suppressed by the Royal Navy and the British Army and the militia and these allied Maroons, they're still taking those chances. So I tend to not accept those characterizations. And I certainly wouldn't accept them for India. One of the kind of schools of thought that informed me in my training was, I guess you could call it a a school of thought called Subaltern Studies, especially a scholar like Ranajit Guha. Yes, right? And so you see kind of even people who are colonized, right? When you actually begin to go and look at their history, when you go and explore it in detail and take it seriously and take their politics seriously, those kinds of sweeping characterizations of people as, you know, evacuated of history and uncreative, they just don't make a lot of sense. Yeah. I mean, I think partly if we're ignorant of those subaltern histories, it can seem as if, right, the only characterization of them we have is the characterization by the slaveholders, by the colonists, by the oppressors, right? But when you really begin to look at that history, I believe that falls apart. And it's not easy to do. I mean, let's be honest, like, it's much easier to write the history of slaveholders because they left voluminous records. They talked about what they were doing, right? These enslaved people I'm talking about are largely illiterate, and we have to think about their actions, speculate on their aims, learn about their tactics by reading between the lines of the planters and slaveholders' history. That takes an extra step. It takes a lot of work, but it's worth doing. Otherwise, we're left with this idea that the planters' pejorative characterizations of the enslaved, that the colonists' pejorative representations of Indians, that upper caste representations of lower caste people, that's the truth. And that's just never been the truth.
Yep, gentleman at the front there.
Mr. Brown, hello. Mr. Brown, when you were talking about the matter of reparations, right? You spoke about how it's... Hello? Yeah, when you spoke about the matter of reparations, you spoke about how it is not just enough, it's not just a matter of money. And as there is an ever-growing chasm in time between the point of the exploitation, which just keeps growing to today, when you say there needs to be a more total repair, what is your sense of what that total repair has to be like? If it's not just a matter of, you know, economic support, or what is your view on it?
Yeah.
What does total repair look like?
Thank you. So, I mean, I will say, and this is a kind of controversial opinion among people that I generally agree with, but let me throw it out there, which is, I think the state that would pay reparations to you monetarily is the state that wouldn't have to. And what I mean by that is that any state, any entity that continues to exploit you, right, is not really going to pay you the kind of reparations that will lead to the absence of that exploitation. Any entity that continues to profit on the denial of your dignity is never going to give you the kind of repair, right, that's going to dignify you to their level. So my own view is that first we have to decide where we're going. That if we believe in equality, that if we believe in a society where every individual should have an equal chance to succeed, where if the disabilities of race and gender and caste and sexuality and religion are not going to hold people in particular places, then we have to agree that that's the direction we want to go. And no single payment, right, no single action is going to achieve that. But if we're working toward the same horizon, hopefully we move there together, as opposed to thinking that we can resolve that and create a year zero with one monetary payout, right, or one act of repair. Does that make sense? So for me, it's like, what kind of society do we want to have? Are we working toward that kind of society? And can we work together toward that kind of society? Because I don't believe that there is a number that paid once is going to fix the history that we're talking about here, right? It's a continuous process of repair that has to be engaged in. And that is about our vision for the future. If we believe in a society where people are equal, then let's work toward that.
Thank you very much, Professor Vincent Brown, and for all your talk today, and for your wonderful and very important book. I congratulate you on it. Thanks very much.
Thank you all.
Please do.